Hi, Planet Reporters. Today, let's talk about the start of your story for the first draft. Before you watch this video, you should have read the Anatomy of a Planet story chapter from the Planet Handbook. That's the one that really breaks down the structure of a planet story, the different components of it, and how they all come together to create a really compelling narrative. I want to talk today about the start of your story. So one of the things that's important to remember as you're writing a planet story is that once it's published, nobody needs to read it. There's no obligation for your readers. It's a little different from a lot of academic work, right? Where you write a paper and your professor has to read it. They're kind of a captive audience, right? So readers of the planet are not a captive audience. If the story doesn't sound interesting, they just won't read it. If it's interesting for a few paragraphs and then it starts to drag, they'll just stop. So it's one of the kind of brutal truths that all journalists have to face up to. And so the real question as you're going into writing these stories is, how do I make my story so compelling, so engaging, that once the reader starts, they can't stop. They can't put it down until they get to the end. So right now, the question is sort of how do you sort of set that hook, right, that pulls them through the story. It's a little bit different from a news brief. With a news brief, the assignment that you just did, your lead, so the very start of the story was one sentence, maybe two, and really states clearly what the news is in this very matter-of-fact kind of way. The lead for a magazine story is different, and it serves a different purpose. The purpose of the lead in a magazine story that's longer is to really catch the reader's attention, to hook them in, to spark their curiosity. And it's typically 1 to 2 paragraphs, a little bit longer, and it doesn't give away all the key news of the story right at the outset. But it needs to be engaging enough that they want to get to that. So that's the lead. And then the part that comes right after it is what's called the nut graph. And you might appreciate that it's called that because it's really the heart of the story, the nut of the story. And the nut graph is usually 1 paragraph. It's very catchy, usually pretty short. And it's trying to do 2 things. It's trying to tell the reader what the story is about and why it matters. That's it. The nut graph should not be jam-packed with facts. You're not trying to squeeze everything from the story into that nut graph. Think of it like a movie preview. When you watch a movie preview, you are sort of pulled into the main action, right? But it doesn't mean that you know the name of every character. It doesn't mean you know every event that's going to happen in the whole movie. You just get the barest bones of the most compelling part of the story. So a nut graph is like a movie preview. The other thing that a nut graph is really important to do is that it orients the reader. It prepares them for what's coming. You can imagine that you have spent weeks living with this story and you're going to spend some more weeks living with it. But for a reader who picks up the story or clicks on it on a website, they have never seen this story before, and they start to read the lead, and maybe the lead is slightly mysterious. You're not quite sure what's going on. It sounds interesting, but you're not quite clear. At some point, you need to take the reader by the hand and say, hey, this is what this story is going to be about. This is where we're going. Now come with me. And that's the purpose of the nut graph. Otherwise, the reader starts to feel like, I'm not quite sure what this story is. I'm kind of wandering around. I don't know where we're going. And that's one of the major kind of danger points when a reader will just stop. And so the nut graph partly orients people. Hey, here's where we're going. Come with me. It's going to be fun. And it's going to be engaging, and it's going to be enlightening. So the lead and the nut graph. Those are really the sort of critical entrances into the story. The rest of the story obviously is vital as well. It's not like you do the lead and the nut graph and then it just tails off. But you should really, for the first draft, be consulting the Anatomy of a Planet Story handbook chapter for advice on how to structure the rest of your story. In future weeks, I'm going to be going into those parts in more detail in the video lectures. But for today, let's take a closer look at examples of the lead and examples of the nut graph, because it's one thing to hear me talk about them in theory, but I think looking at examples is what's really going to help you understand how they work. So let's take a look. Okay, before we jump into taking a look at a few examples of leads and nut graphs, I just want to give you a few key rules for your lead. First of all is the lead must be relevant. It must have a clear connection to the rest of the story. It shouldn't be there just to be pretty. Second, it must be interesting. It must be something that really grabs the reader right from the start. You don't want to start slowly. You're in danger of losing someone. And finally, it must hint at the news in the first sentence, or at the extreme, at the second sentence. There has to be some suggestion of something being significant. If you just have a description of a pretty scene and there's no evidence of action, reader's going to quickly wonder why they're there. So let's take a look at a couple of different examples that are going to give us a clearer sense of what I've been talking about. The first one is one that you've been looking at. It's the what I call the classic scene lead and nut graph, and it's from the story about the swan poisoning. And the first sentence, let's look at this. The first sentence, for 17 days straight, Martha Jordan was forced to watch a trumpeter swan die just out of her arm's reach. Wow. That's a really powerful sentence. It really grabs you, and it also makes you wonder what's going on, right? You wonder, why is this swan dying? Why is Martha Jordan trying to get it? Why is it just out of her arm's reach? Right? Lots of questions, but you clearly realize that Martha Jordan is the main character, and this has something to do with swans dying. So you have some hint about what the story is going to be about. All right, then we read a little further. The swan, sick from ingesting lead ammunition pellets, flew across a frozen slough near a roadside ditch. Unaware of Jordan's good intentions, the white-feathered, glossy-beaked bird escaped to the only place Jordan and her team of volunteers couldn't access. Okay, so this really starts to paint a scene, and it also starts to answer some questions that people would have. Why is the bird sick? Where is this story happening? It's at a roadside ditch. Dozens of concerned people called Jordan about the sick swan. Days passed. The swan didn't move. By the time the ice broke and Jordan could reach it, the bird was alive, but too sick to save. There's the end of this little story. That was probably my most heart-wrenching one this year, knowing it's only 100 feet from you, but you can't go there because if you do, you could die, said Jordan, a wildlife scientist and founder of the Northwest Swan Conservation Association. What a great ending quote, right? So it's like a conclusion of a tiny little story right here, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, really. And also, you clearly know who Jordan is at this point. Sometimes I see leads that start with these weird anonymous people. Sometimes they're not even named, a woman. You don't want that. We're about facts. We're about giving people specific information. So here's the lead. Now we turn to the nut graph. Jordan took interest in the lead problem in 1999 after scientists found about 100 dead swans at Judson Lake, which straddles the border with Canada just west of the Whatcom County town of Sumas. In 2000, the event repeated itself. Almost 20 years later, swans continue to die of lead poisoning all over the Pacific Northwest, and scientists and government officials struggle to agree on a solution. Sometimes I just come home and I want to scream because it's so unnecessary, Jordan said. This is a strong nut graph because it tells you what the story is about and why it matters. The story is about this phenomenon of all these swans dying. And it's about this attempt to try to find a solution. And Why does it matter? Well, it matters because you have a lot of dying swans, right? It's not hard to convince people of that. But it also points to, it matters because you see that there are all these people who are working to find a solution, but they're struggling to do it. And finally, using a really strong quote can be an effective way to end a conclusion. You see, it's almost like putting an exclamation point. I'm sorry, not a conclusion, the end of a nut graph. It's almost like putting an exclamation point at the end of it. But you want to be sure it's a really strong, punchy quote. So that's sort of the classic scene setting lead and nut graph. And it works well quite often. But it doesn't mean you have to do it that way. Here's what I would call the short and sweet lead. It's by a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Your leads do not need to be long. You can see this one here. High on a mountain overlook, construction crews blast through solid rock on a 20 hours a day rush schedule to build the first 2 miles of an expressway that, for the next few years, will lead only to a turnaround. So, at first, this doesn't necessarily promise to be that interesting. You have people who are building a road, right? The fact that they're doing it 20 hours a day in a rush schedule, well, maybe that makes it a little more interesting. And then the final punch is this final phrase. It'll lead only to a turnaround, right? So that is a hook for the readers. It leaves them curious. Why would you build a road like that? And now here's the nut graph. So it's a 1-paragraph lead. It's a 1-sentence lead, really. But for promoters in this Appalachian University town, that's of little concern. Dubbed the Smart Road and designed to double as a high-technology research site, this federal state project shows how a little pork tucked into a federal transportation bill can buy a whole hog for a community. Okay, now we know what this story is really going to be about. It's going to be partly about this road, but it's also going to be about how pork in federal legislation can make this huge impact in a community. So this is the bigger story. It's what the story's about. So in 2 paragraphs, this has really delivered a nice lead and a nice nut graph. So don't feel like yours have to go on for a long time. So those are both scenes. This one is a scene of people doing construction. And notice you could really do this scene without needing to be there. And likewise, you could really do the earlier scene. In fact, the reporter was not at that scene. They reconstructed it by interviewing people who were. Okay, final example. You don't have to do a scene. So this is what I would call the interesting statement lead and nut graph. Sometimes just stating something that is interesting and grabs a reader's attention without a scene is a way to pull them in. I think sometimes scenes are too commonly used because it's kind of the easy default. So here's this one. The white-rumped vulture hasn't gotten much respect in Bangladesh. Right? So the first sentence is designed to make you think, oh, I wonder why not? What's going on with the white-rumped vulture? Why don't people respect it? Its hunched slate-gray wings, bald head, and taste for carrion have marked it as a symbol of doom. People avoid the shadows of circling vultures, fearing their touch brings sickness. A vulture perched on a house signals bad luck for an inhabitant. People have beaten the birds with bamboo sticks and pelted them with stones. As if that's not enough, they have been pushed to the edge of extinction in South Asia, thanks to poisoning from a drug used on cattle. So that's more like a list of interesting details. It's not a scene. Now we get to this. Now an animal once described as one of the most prolific raptors and perhaps one of its most repellent is getting a makeover. Conservationists, with the aid of South Asian governments, are pouring millions of dollars into trying to pull this vulture and 2 other species back from the brink. National governments have banned one of the most problematic drugs. Captive breeding centers are hatching hundreds of chicks. Okay, more interesting details about action that's going on. So that's really the lead. Here we're going to move into the nut graph. But the bird's fate rests partly on humbler grassroots work. Across much of the Indian subcontinent, conservationists are trying to rally local residents, veterinarians, and government officials near the remaining pockets of vultures. They hope a combination of enforcement, education, and incentives in these areas could turn the maligned animal into a mascot people want to save and create vulture-friendly zones where the birds can flourish. They don't love them like tigers or elephants. That's why this is a problem, says Sarawar Alam, the head of the Bangladesh Vulture Conservation Program for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the group leading the effort in that country. This is a majestic bird. Again, this is trying to use the quote as sort of a final punchline, but you can see it spells out what the story is about. It's about this effort to win over local people to become vulture advocates. And then the significance is really it's been already spelled out that the fate of these species might lie on this effort. So I hope that this gives you a couple of examples of what a lead in a nut graph can be like. I'm going to post this on the Canvas website and the modules for this week so that if you want to look at it at your leisure, you can do that. All right. I hope that gives you a pretty clear idea of what makes for a strong lead and a strong nut graph. And I hope it sparked some ideas for you as you think about how to do that for your own story. Each story is a little different. Each story will have a different lead. Each one will have a different nut graph. And so even though I've offered you this guidance, it's going to be up to you to really think about how to apply these tools to your story. And it's not always easy. It can often take a couple of tries and some real-time thinking things through. And I really encourage you to take that time because you're going to be rewarded with a story that is engaging for you and also one that the readers will read. So I'm looking forward to seeing your leads and nut graphs and the rest of the story.